Hello everyone, and welcome to week 7 of BIO6601, Environmental and Biological Ethics. I'm Dr. Kaelyn Fogelman, and in this lecture we'll be exploring the complex intersection of environmental and biological ethics through the lens of progress versus protection and environmental justice. Today we're going to examine how marginalized communities have been impacted by environmental policy decisions, look at critical case studies, and question how ethical frameworks inform real-world environmental outcomes. So let's begin by unpacking the term environmental justice. Sometimes this is also referred to as eco-justice, and this term goes far beyond conservation. It focuses on the intersection of environmental health and social equity. Environmental justice asks who benefits from environmental protection and who bears the burden of environmental harms. It challenges us to think about how race, income, geography, and politics shape environmental outcomes in both local and global contexts. As we proceed, consider how these principles might apply not only to pollution and land use, but to broader biomedical and public health decisions as well. So let's pause here and take a closer look at this image. At first glance, this might appear to be just a photo of a landscape, but if we examine this through the lens of environmental justice, there is a story beneath this surface. So ask yourself what visual elements in this image might indicate environmental injustice. Are there visible signs of pollution, industrial development near residential areas, or lack of infrastructure? Can you identify who lives here and whether they had a voice in the decisions that have shaped their environment? These are the kinds of questions that environmental ethics demands we ask. Who benefits from this landscape and who bears the risk? Feel free to pause the lecture here and jot down a few reflections. We're going to build on this visual framework in our next sections. So what is environmental justice? This is more than just a buzzword. It is a social movement. It demands fair access to environmental benefits like clean air and water, and equitable protection from environmental hazards. So if you look at this image on this slide, which is similar to the image we saw in the last one, I want you to consider what visual cues suggest environmental injustice. Is it industrial proximity, infrastructure, decay, lack of green space? The core idea is this: no group of people, especially not on the basis of race, class, or nationality, should disproportionately suffer from environmental harms. So here's how the U.S. government formally defines environmental justice: the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that may sound technical, but it does have real implications. For instance, a community of color that is located near a petrochemical plant isn't just unlucky. They may be the product of zoning laws and environmental regulations that overlooked or excluded them. Environmental justice demands not just protection, but participation in the decision-making process. For a deeper look about what areas may be exposed to environmental injustices, there is the EJ Atlas, so you can visit that, the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. And this is an interactive database that catalogs environmental conflicts worldwide, including dozens of ongoing cases in the United States. This is a really valuable resource for researchers, advocates, and educators to visualize patterns of inequity and resistance across the globe. So you can take a moment if you go to ejatlas.org and explore this. Each of these dots that you click on will show you the color refers to the type of environmental injustice issue. So like this olive color is waste management, red is related to industrial and utilities conflicts, yellow is nuclear. So you see much more yellow in the Southwest, for example. You're seeing waste management and industrial or utilities issues here in the Southeast being prevalent. In the Northeast, you're definitely seeing a mix of industrial and utilities conflicts, fossil fuels and climate justice or energy justice, waste management, you're getting some nuclear, And you can see up here in the Northwest, there's not really as much in some of these less populated areas of the country. But if you go to the EJ Atlas, you can click on each of these dots and it's gonna link you to the case of what is going on currently. So when we talk about environmental justice issues, environmental injustices show up in a variety of forms. So we're going to examine some of the most pressing forms of environmental injustice, starting with air pollution. So studies show that 71% of African Americans live in counties that fail to meet federal air pollution standards. 71%, that's compared to 51% of white populations that live in counties that fail to meet air pollution standards. So chronic exposure to poor air quality contributes to asthma, high blood pressure, and even sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS for short. Then we have industrial sites and illegal waste dumping. So most communities of color live near power plants, oil refineries, or waste management facilities like landfills. Those are all disproportionately located near communities of color. The placement of those is not accidental. It often results from decades of discriminatory policy and lack of regulatory oversight. Then we have mercury exposure. So mercury is a heavy metal that bioaccumulates in fish, and people of color statistically consume fish at higher rates than white populations. So the result of that is that they have higher exposures to the neurotoxic substances. Mercury is a neurotoxin. So those neurotoxins are linked to learning disabilities and developmental delays in children. This also is linked to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, as well. So this brings us then to another issue of water safety. So many communities of color in the United States, especially in rural or underfunded areas, still lack access to clean and safe drinking water. In some areas, families swim near waste-contaminated beaches, or they live near floodwaters that are often polluted with industrial runoff. And this isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Waterborne illnesses, heavy metal contamination, and long-term exposure to chemicals can lead to devastating health consequences. We'll see this issue recur at the end of the lecture when we discuss some specific case studies, including Flint, Michigan. So next up we have transit justice. So public transportation is disproportionately relied on by low-income or minority communities or populations. Yet ironically, these communities often have less access to efficient and safe transit systems. Public transit routes are more likely to fragment neighborhoods or be fueled by diesel, exposing residents to elevated levels of carbon particles and air toxins. And then lastly, here we have food deserts. So for food deserts, that is an area where people have limited or no access to affordable, nutritious food, especially food that's culturally relevant for those communities. These food deserts tend to be low income or urban neighborhoods, or in isolated rural areas where grocery stores are sparse and fast food is the default. This has massive consequences on public health, including obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. So for an example of a food desert, if you guys are located in Alabama, think about those stretches of areas or those small towns where there are no grocery stores. There's not a Walmart, there's not a Walmart neighborhood market, there's no Publix, there's no Piggly Wiggly, there's no Kroger. The only thing that is locally available is a Dollar General. And the Dollar General may have shelf-stable food, but there's no fresh food, like fruits and vegetables or fresh meats there. So that's an example of a food desert that's very, very common in low-income or rural areas within Alabama. So continuing this examination of significant environmental justice issues, let's talk about a few of some of the severe and far-reaching impacts, extending out to urban green spaces. So access to quality parks and green areas is not just for aesthetic purposes, it is a matter of physical and mental health. So studies have shown that people of color often have less access to green spaces, which limits recreational opportunities and increases exposure to environmental stressors. Then we have lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is arguably one of the most damaging environmental justice issues that we face. Low-income children are 8 times more likely to suffer from lead poisoning due to aging infrastructure, contaminated water, and poor housing conditions. Lead exposure has devastating lifelong effects on neurological development, behavior, and academic achievement. And then finally, we have urban heat islands, and this is related to climate change as well. So dense urban areas where people of color disproportionately live can be up to 15 degrees Celsius warmer than surrounding rural regions. These areas are warmer because they tend to lack tree cover and green roofs that reduce heat, or they have all of this dark heat absorbing materials like concrete, asphalt, building infrastructures. So combined with limited access to air conditioning units, this puts vulnerable populations at twice the risk of dying during heat waves. So these injustices, lack of urban green space, mercury exposure, lead poisoning, lack of access to clean water, those things did not just appear overnight. They're rooted in a long history of environmental neglect and policy failures. So next, let's look at where the environmental justice movement began and how it evolved from local protests to receiving national attention and regulation. So the story of environmental justice in the United States has its roots in grassroots resistance, particularly in Black and low-income communities. One of the most pivotal events began in 1978 in North Carolina. A transformer company in Raleigh illegally dumped 31,000 gallons of PCB-contaminated oil along 240 miles of rural roads across 14 counties. PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, are highly toxic and linked to cancer, immune system suppression, and developmental issues. So the state eventually initiated a cleanup effort, but instead of taking responsibility, the state decided to consolidate the contaminated soil into a landfill to be built in Warren County. Warren County is a rural, predominantly Black and low-income community. This decision was made without community consultation, reinforcing a pattern of environmental decision-making that disregards marginalized voices. So in 1982, several years after the initial pollution event occurred, so 1982, the people within Warren County rose up. They staged protests, they blocked trucks, they marched alongside national civil rights leaders, including members of the NAACP. These protests lasted over 6 weeks, and they resulted in more than 500 arrests and drew national media attention. So although the state moved forward with the landfill construction, this moment is widely recognized as the catalyst for the U.S. environmental justice movement. For the first time, the environmental and civil rights movements intersected in a sustained and visible way. But the story didn't end there. The community did persist, and through the 1980s and the 1990s, Warren County residents, scientists, and activists fought for long-term remediation of the landfill site. They demanded studies, transparency, and cleanup. So finally, in 2004, almost 30 years later, the site was finally decontaminated. So the soil was treated and detoxified, marking a delayed but important victory, one that symbolized both the persistence of local advocacy and the slow arc of the environmental justice movement. So as we move on to our next slide, we're going to see how the early work of these communities began to influence federal agencies and academic institutions, eventually leading to more formalized recognition of the environmental injustice in policy and in research. So this movement gained further traction in the 1990s, especially when academia and government began to take notice. In 1990, the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources held the first major conference focused on race and environmental hazards. That same year, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, formed a work group on environmental equity. This marked a significant milestone because for the first time, a federal agency acknowledged that environmental harms were not being equally distributed and that this mattered ethically and legally. So this shift laid the groundwork for future policy reforms and community-driven environmental science. I want you to pause this lecture video now and watch the linked video. It's in your Canvas Week 7 module, but this is the environmental justice summary. So pause here and watch this concise visual summary of the history that we've just explained. Let's now apply these concepts to a real community. In Commerce City, California. This is a low-income Latino community situated at the crossroads of multiple major freeways and railway lines. It also has proximity to shipping ports, dozens of small industrial sites, and constant truck and train traffic. The result of this is that the community is blanketed with airborne pollutants year-round. Residents, including children, face chronic health conditions like asthma, cardiovascular issues, and developmental concerns due to particulate matter and industrial chemicals. But here's where environmental justice comes into play. Rather than remaining passive to this ongoing pollution, residents organized. Local nonprofits and community health groups began pressuring both government regulators and transport companies to clean up the air, reroute traffic, and implement pollution reduction technologies. So this case is a powerful example of the grassroots resilience in the face of structural neglect of a community or an unequal distribution of pollution. And now I want you to pause this lecture video to watch the video that I've linked in your Week 7 module on Commerce City, California. So this footage is going to offer insight into how residents are affected and how advocacy groups mobilize to challenge pollution. When you're finished watching, resume this lecture video and we're going to move into our second case study taking place in North Carolina. So here we're going to resume with an ethical case study having to do with industrial agriculture, specifically for hog farming. So North Carolina is the second largest hog producer in the United States with over 10 million hogs raised annually. This is a billion-dollar industry that significantly impacts not only the economy, but the air, the water, and the soil of surrounding communities. Hogs generate vast amounts of waste, more than 19 million tons annually in North Carolina alone. The standard industry practice is to store the waste in open-air lagoons and spray it over nearby fields, but wind and water runoff do not respect those boundaries, so surrounding areas, often communities of color and low-income residents, experience direct exposure to airborne pathogens, contaminated drinking water, and foul odors. One of the most egregious ethical conflicts occurred when the state attempted to approve the construction of one of the largest hog farms in a county that was 90 to 98% people of color and one of the poorest counties in the state. This raised very serious concerns because was this location chosen because of scientific or logistical considerations or because the residents there were seen as politically powerless? This case laid bare several core environmental justice principles, one being disproportionate impact. These communities of color were being asked to bear the brunt of a health and environmental hazard. Lack of informed consent. Residents are not given meaningful input into the planning process or the distribution of these industrial farms. Exploitation of political vulnerability. So the decision to locate farms in areas that are low income or disproportionately communities of color. This reflects a broader pattern of targeting communities least able to fight back. But in this instance, where they wanted to create this very large farm in a predominantly Black county, the people did push back and they won. So this is a prime example of environmental justice, which does include that advocacy and intervention. So they used local activists, legal advocates, and public health researchers. And because of that, the proposed farm was ultimately relocated to a different rural area. While that outcome raises further environmental questions about environmental burden shifting, it does mark a rare victory for an overburdened community. So here we have a study that was done, Environmental Injustice in North Carolina's Hog Industry. So this industrial agriculture is such an issue that it is studied by researchers. And what they looked at is population demographics located in relation to density of industrial agriculture farms in North Carolina. So here in this top left panel, this is a map of the counties in North Carolina. The areas that are shaded out in gray were excluded counties in this survey, but all of these red dots are the hog farm operations, or these industrial agriculture at scale. So if we move over here, this is your proportion of persons in poverty. So the lighter the red color, the lower the density of individuals that are living below the poverty line, but the darker that it starts to get, the higher the proportion of individuals that are living below the poverty line. So you can see your lighter areas here, there aren't as many industrial hog farms, but where you start to see your darker colors, that is where you do have a density of industrial agriculture occurring. So if we look at this bottom left panel, this is looking at non-white populations. So again, the lighter the color, that would be predominantly white populations, and then the darker the color, the higher the proportion of communities of color. So again, here where we see almost no industrial agriculture occurring, that's predominantly white communities in those counties. And then where we see more of a concentration of communities of color, that's where we see more industrial agriculture occurring. And then similarly, population density, so the lower the density, the lower density areas, which likely will be more rural, that's where we're having more of these operations occur. And then you have about a medium population density here, and again, mostly white populations where you don't see a lot of agriculture or industrial agriculture occurring. So this case, these hog farms being disproportionately placed in low income or communities of color, or counties that are low income or predominantly communities of color, that is so well documented that it has risen to the level of academic discourse, academic research. So this paper just really looked at the patterns of placing these large scale animal operations in predominantly Black or low income communities. So this research did provide empirical evidence for what activists had been saying at the time, that these environmental injustices aren't just theoretical, they're quantifiable and they're policy driven. So this paper continued to be a foundational reference in both environmental ethics and environmental health policy. So here on this next slide, this is just showing those relationships between poverty, non-white population density, and the amount of people, as well as the total amount of hog operations and the pounds of hog produced. So for example, if we see higher amount of individuals above the poverty line, so here you have higher, as you go down, you have higher amounts of individuals living below the poverty line. So as you see that number increase, you also see an increase in the number of total hog operations and the amount of hog produced in millions. So then as you also start to see higher percentages of non-white communities within counties, you also see the amount of hog operations increasing. So there was definitely a direct and quantifiable relationship between poverty, communities of color, and where these industrial agricultural operations were being placed within the state. So now I want you to pause the lecture video again and watch this linked video that I have on hog farming impacts. So this is going to offer firsthand accounts from residents, along with a closer look at the health and environmental consequences of industrial livestock production. So when you're ready, we're going to explore our third case study, which turns our attention to indigenous lands of the American Southwest and the legacy of uranium mining. So if you remember, back when we looked at the EJ Atlas, we did see some uranium environmental injustices occurring within the Southwest United States. So this next case does center on one of the most historically marginalized populations in environmental justice. Those are indigenous communities, particularly the Navajo Nation. So following World War II, as the U.S. ramped up its nuclear weapons program and began expanding nuclear energy infrastructure, attention did turn to uranium-rich lands of the American Southwest. Large deposits of uranium were located beneath Navajo Nation territory, spanning Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Over the following decades, hundreds of uranium mines were established across tribal lands, and indigenous workers, desperate for employment in chronically under-resourced areas, were recruited to work in those uranium mines with little to no safety training. So what makes this case particularly unethical is that these workers were not informed of the risks associated with their uranium exposure, despite the government and the mining companies already being aware of the serious health hazards, including lung cancer, kidney disease, and radiation poisoning. These were not isolated incidents. Many workers lived in homes built with contaminated materials taken from nearby mines. Radioactive tailings were left in open areas, often near schools and water sources, and families used contaminated water for drinking, cooking, and bathing, unaware of the risks. The resulting health crisis spanned generations, including birth defects, cancers, and respiratory diseases. So go ahead and watch this video from the EPA on uranium contaminated structures in the Navajo Nation. And then when you're ready, there is another longer video going over the history of this from Box. And I just want to point out that as the dangers became undeniable, this is like the solution, the impact of this case study. So as those dangers became undeniable, there was obviously correlation between the health effects that these individuals were studying and those individuals that were working in the uranium mines or were exposed to these contaminated soils, this contaminated water. These individuals began to demand justice. The response to this, though, was very slow and very inadequate, as you've seen from many of the unethical instances that we've been discussing in this class. By the 1990s and the 2000s, more attention was brought to this issue through advocacy, public health research, and legal pressures, but the Navajo Nation has since pushed for compensation for health impacts through federal radiation exposure programs, cleanup of abandoned mines, and tailings, removal, and decontamination of radioactive homes and buildings. And despite these demands, progress still remains limited. There are still hundreds of abandoned uranium mines across Navajo lands, many of which have yet to be fully remediated. This is a haunting reminder of how long-term environmental injustice can persist even decades after the original harm and the recognition of that harm. So go ahead and watch this video on Navajo uranium mining to deepen your understanding of the background of this, the implications of that pollution, and then what has come since. So this video includes interviews with community members, and it does offer a sobering look at the human cost of extractive industries on indigenous lands. So after this video, when you're ready, we're going to turn our attention to a more recent case, one that became a national and international scandal, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. So the Flint water crisis is not just a story of infrastructure failure, it is a case study in environmental racism, public deception, and systemic disregard for marginalized communities. Flint is a post-industrial city in Michigan which has long struggled with economic decline, poverty, and deindustrialization. In 2014, as part of a cost-cutting effort, city officials switched the water supply from Detroit's treated water system to the local Flint River. This is a river that was known historically as an industrial dumping ground that at one point even caught fire due to pollution, much like a lot of rivers in the United States. The new water source was highly corrosive, and why is this important? The officials failed to add corrosion inhibitors, which is a basic and required water treatment step. As a result, because it was corrosive, the untreated water began to leach lead from the city's aging pipes. This contaminated drinking water across thousands of homes in Flint. The population within Flint is predominantly Black and low income, with more than 40% of individuals living below the poverty line. From an environmental justice standpoint, this crisis unfolded along the following ethically troubling lines. So first was delayed recognition. Despite residents reporting brown water, rashes, and foul smells, government officials initially denied there was a problem, despite individuals testing the water and telling them that there were issues with it, including researchers. So while they may have known, they delayed actually recognizing that there was an issue to the public. There was a dismissal of concerns. So public complaints were ridiculed and whistleblowers were discredited. Again, those scientists that were showing them data that says, hey, there's an issue with the water, here's the issue. And also systemic neglect. This would almost certainly not have happened or not been allowed to persist in a more affluent or a predominantly white community. The most tragic element is that thousands of children were exposed to lead. Lead is a neurotoxin with irreversible developmental consequences. So even after the switch back to Detroit water, trust in public systems had been fundamentally broken. Eventually, national media attention, investigations, and lawsuits did find accountability. The city reverted to its original water supply. State officials resigned or were criminally charged. Millions were allocated for pipe replacement and health services. But that alone did not allow for a clean resolution. Many residents still distrust their tap water and the government, and long-term health outcomes are still being monitored. Flint reminds us that environmental justice isn't just about protecting ecosystems, it's about protecting people. Because if we remember Leopold's land ethics, people are part of the land. So if we're protecting the land, we're protecting the environment, that includes the people within it as well. When institutions fail in their ethical duty, the consequences can last generations. So now I want you to pause our video again and watch this video that's linked on this slide to hear directly from Flint residents and activists. Their voices highlight a personal side of what may appear to be a political or a technical issue. When you're ready, we're going to go on to our final case study, which is a more recent and ongoing case in Uniontown, Alabama. This is where residents are still battling for justice in the face of industrial pollution and government inaction. So this brings us to our final case study in Uniontown, Alabama, which is a very small rural town that illustrates how environmental justice struggles are ongoing and often met with governmental indifference. Uniontown has a population that is over 90% African American, and more than 40% of residents are living below the poverty line. The town faces two major sources of pollution, one being the Arrowhead landfill, and this landfill doesn't just serve Alabama, it accepts waste from 33 different states, including 4 million cubic yards of coal ash that was shipped here from a major spill in Kingston, Texas in 2008. Coal ash contains toxic substances like arsenic, mercury, and lead, and its disposal in Uniontown was approved by both ADEM and EPA. So ADEM is the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. So EPA is a federal agency, and then ADEM is basically Alabama's state equivalent of that. The second source of pollution that is an issue is the Southeastern Cheese Corporation. So this is a local dairy processor that contributes to air, water, and soil contamination. This exacerbates the region's already fragile sanitation infrastructure. Residents have reported respiratory problems, skin conditions, and an overwhelming smell of decay. Yet their complaints are often ignored by state and federal regulators. So the environmental justice issues in Uniontown mirror those in other case studies. There's a disproportionate exposure to toxic waste, governmental disregard for marginalized communities, lack of meaningful involvement in environmental decision making. But like the communities in Warren County, Commerce City, and Flint, the people of Uniontown are not silent. They fought back through activism, lawsuits, media exposure, and appeals to international human rights organizations. Their resistance shows that environmental justice is not only about preventing harm, it is about restoring dignity, demanding accountability, and building sustainable futures. So now if you want to pause this lecture video, I do have two final linked videos for you going through this Uniontown, Alabama case study, and you can hear directly from residents and advocates regarding this issue. These are powerful first-person accounts of how environmental harm intersects with race, poverty, and power. So this brings us to the end of our Week 7 lecture on environmental justice. And as we close this lecture, I do want to leave you with some final reflections and assignments to deepen your engagement. So first, you'll participate in this week's discussion forum. Your initial post is due Wednesday, May 7th, and your peer reviews are due Sunday, or your peer replies are due Sunday, May 11th. And in this week, you're going to consider sharing your thoughts on current regulatory actions or policies or executive orders, something that's going on in the current administration. And I want you to give me an example of a recent action that has either perpetuated an environmental injustice or has resulted in an environmental justice being served. So then I want you to do your reflection assignment, which will be due next Wednesday, so within week 8. I'm giving you 2 films to choose from. Erin Brockovich is a little bit older. It's a dramatized account of environmental legal activism based on a true story. And then Dark Waters is a little bit more recent, but it's only available on Amazon. So I wanted to give you 2 choices, the Troy Library option or the paid option. So this is a real life story about corporate chemical contamination and the ethical fight that followed. So the films that I've picked for this week help you think critically about individual moral responsibility, systemic failures, and how science and advocacy intersect in the real world. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to message me on Canvas. I'll respond within 24 to 48 hours. Thank you for your thoughtful attention today, and I look forward to hearing your insights in this week's discussions and reflections.